Hello and welcome back to our Type 1 Diabetes Foundation series. My name's Curtis and today we're talking all things basal insulin. This really is the foundation of our insulin types, and if your basal is shaky, it's going to make all of your Type 1 diabetes decisions after that a lot more challenging. Whether you're brand new to Type 1, welcome, or if you've been at this game for a little while, this is going to be really great foundational information that will help you perhaps alter or upskill in the area of basal insulin. So let's figure out how we're going to learn about basal insulin. We're going to have a look first off at what is it and how do we use it. Then we're going to go through some little tricks and tips of how you might know if your basal insulin needs a little bit of updating through some easy overnight basal testing. Then we're going to have a look at some of the important factors you need to be aware of that could require you to change your basal insulin rate before having a pretty detailed conversation around pumps, algorithms, and basal. There's a lot going on in this space, particularly around newer pumps that are learning and that may impact your decision on the pump that you want to get. So let's have a look at this little diagram first. So many of you may be familiar that to eat we take insulin. That's what we refer to as bolus insulin. And that's trying to cover all of the glucose that comes from our digestion and the food we eat. But there's another really important source of glucose that comes into our bloodstream, and that is from the liver. Now the liver has the ability to provide a trickle 24/7 of glucose into the bloodstream. That's really important because otherwise we'd need to be eating 24/7 to ensure that we have enough glucose circulating to power and give energy to all of our organs. This function of the liver to trickle glucose into the bloodstream is what allows us to keep thinking, our heart to keep pumping, and our muscles to keep moving, even in periods of fasting and even overnight as well. And then a little reminder that there are two ways in which we can get glucose from the blood vessel into our cells. The primary way that we're concerned with in Type 1 diabetes management is insulin that we manually inject to ourselves, but it is always worth noting that exercise can open the door to the cell and allow glucose to enter. So a little bit more detail on basal insulin. When do we get it? It would be really great if the liver just provided a constant, steady rate of trickle from the liver into our bloodstream. Unfortunately, that's not the case. So we have a look here. We've got a full 24-hour period on the horizontal line there. Anything that's going to appear on the top section here is glucose that is being released from the liver into the bloodstream. And on the bottom here, that's where we're going to put the insulin that we manually give ourselves. So we can have a look here and you can see that this is a general pattern which most people will follow in terms of how much glucose is being released from the liver when. The exact timings and how much dip and fall through these periods is going to be dependent on your body. So as you can see here, generally in the morning or early hours, we have this surge of hormones in our body, often referred to as the dawn phenomenon, and that results in the liver releasing more glucose into the body, making sure all of the cells and organs in your body have the required energy to get up and start moving through the day. As we warm up through the day and we're doing more activities, the release of glucose from the liver reduces during the middle of the day here. Now, that's the body is more efficient at using glucose, and you're doing more activities burning glucose as well. So there's not as requirement of the liver to trickle out as much. In the early hours of the afternoon and evening, we tick up a little bit as we get prepared to repair some of our cells and body overnight before coming back down to a normal sort of resting state throughout the rest of the evening with our glucose that's coming from the liver. Now, one of the big pros of an insulin pump is that we can map this out, or you'll have a manual setting on your pump that will let you map this out hour by hour, and we can match it and pretty much mirror the glucose being trickled out from our liver with our hourly segments on our pump. That's one of the big wins there. Now we will get to talking about different and various algorithms which may not let you set those specific segments towards the end of the video. Now you can see here the other option, which many people are using, basal insulin, in the bottom right corner there. Not all long and super long acting insulins have the same profile, but this is a pretty common approach nowadays where people will use a type of long acting insulin which has this very uniform peak action period here, which is quite flat. Now that's great because it gives us stability, but you can see it doesn't quite match the glucose that's being trickled out of the liver. In the early hours here, you can see there's actually going to be more glucose coming from the liver than there is insulin available, and the same thing again in the afternoon here. But then during the middle of the day, there may actually be too much insulin compared to the glucose that's being trickled out of the liver. So we have to do some other things in changing our insulin to sensitivity ratios, maybe eating more carbs or less carbs, or giving correction boluses to make up for those differing amounts there. That's one of the challenges of using multiple daily injections to manage basal insulin. Not insurmountable in any case, but a bit more challenging than the insulin pump users. So how do you know if your basal is correct? Well, the simple answer is to have your last meal at 6 p.m. and to see what your blood sugars do overnight. By having your last meal at 6 p.m., all the fast-acting insulin will likely be out of your system from that meal by around 11 p.m. or midnight. This gives us a clean slate in which we isolate the two variables, the glucose coming from your liver and the basal insulin that is in your system. By doing this, we can really compare if it's enough or if it's too much insulin. It's important to note for that last meal, it's best if you have a well-balanced meal for you. We don't want to go overboard in terms of high protein or high fat, because this can have a lasting and delayed effect, more so than a normal meal would, on your blood sugars, which can muddy the waters a little bit. It's also worth noting we don't want to do a basal test like this on a night where we've had a particularly abnormally high level of exercise during the day, because that can also impact our blood sugar levels throughout the evening. And really what we're looking for is between these periods that we have on here, in these nighttime sections, when you go to bed, what was your blood glucose level? And when you wake up the next day, what was your blood glucose level? And what we can go for is if it doesn't rise or fall by more than 1.7 millimoles per litre or 30 milligrams per deciliter, your basal's looking pretty good, okay? Now, if you wake up and you're higher than you were when you went to bed and you're more than 1.7 millimoles, that might be an indicator that you haven't got enough insulin working throughout the evening once we've isolated those two variables. So you've got too much glucose coming in from the liver overnight and not enough insulin there to shift it into the cells for recovery. The other side of this is if you've got too much. Now, often if you've got too much basal insulin, the key flag for this is you may be going low during the night. That's not always the answer to that pattern, but it's a pretty common one. So that may be indicated if you wake up lower than where you went to bed, or you could be getting up and treating yourself with a correction carbohydrates during the night. And that could indicate that you've got too much basal insulin on board. If you've got too much or too little, you may want to explore reducing or increasing by sort of 10 or 20% increments night on night until you find that flat level. If you're unsure, everyone has a different level of comfortability, risk and knowledge with their type 1 diabetes. So it's up to you to decide how and when you engage with your healthcare team to help you with your basal management. So we've learned a little bit about what basal is, how we test it, and finding the right dose. Next, it's really important to look at some of the things that can be abnormal that impact our basal and we need to be aware of. So the first one here is sickness. So what happens when your body gets sick, even just a cold, is it kind of goes into battle mode. And a lot of hormones get thrown around, the primary one being cortisol, and that tells your liver to start throwing out a lot more glucose than it normally would. So make sure that all of the cells in the body have enough energy and are ready to fight this infection or sickness that's coming on. The end result of this is more glucose in the bloodstream, higher blood sugars. So you're going to need to increase your basal rate to counteract this if you're wanting your blood sugars to stay nice and level. Hormone cycles. This is particularly important for the ladies who are watching. In the days leading up to your period, the levels of hormones like progesterone and estrogen start to rise, and this leads to a state in the body where you're more resistant to insulin. And what that means is you need more insulin to do the same job than it previously was. In these particular cases, the liver is still releasing the exact same amount of glucose. You just need more insulin to do the same job. So when it's got a particular pattern, this comes around once a month and you can predict it, you can try and get ahead of it as well to make sure you have enough insulin on board to prevent yourself from going high. Exercise can be a complex one, and it's different for everyone and how it works. During aerobic exercise and anaerobic exercise, people can go high and low depending on their body. But really, with basal insulin, we're focusing on the long-term effects. So not right in that activity, but what's happening later that evening. Often, if you are doing a abnormally strenuous session, regardless of the type of exercise, you may need more glucose through the night to recover, and that may mean that for that particular evening, your basal insulin may not be matching the trickle of glucose that's coming out. Mental and emotional stress, this generally has a similar effect to when you're sleeping. Elevated levels of cortisol lead to higher blood glucose levels, and you may need to increase the level of basal insulin to manage those levels. The final one there is alcohol. Now, alcohol is worth mentioning in the conversation around basal insulin, because what happens when you drink alcohol is your liver stops everything and focuses purely on the alcohol. So that means it actually stops trickling out that little bit of glucose that we're so used to having. Now, that's a problem if you've already got basal insulin on board to account for that trickle. That trickle's no longer there, which means you're going to have too much insulin on board. So you may go low during the evening unless you have the ability to turn off that basal a little bit ahead of time, or to reduce it, or some people choose to have a carbohydrate snack to account for the glucose that they're not getting from the liver if they're having a night out drinking. Okay, so let's jump into having a look at pumps and algorithms as well. So we've covered some of the basics of basal insulin, and it really is a powerful tool, and pumps are a powerful tool to help us deliver it. So all pumps will have a manual mode. This is where you have the ability to go in and set your basal rates hour by hour. Now, it's really important to do to get the hang of, because if your pump exits its algorithm for whatever reason, it'll often default to this the modes that you've put in there. Now, that's really good, and you can get ahead of it and program things to match the profile of glucose trickling out into the blood that we saw earlier in this presentation. But then you don't get to use all the fun bits of the algorithm to really help you around meal times, which is where they absolutely shine. So it is good to turn those algorithms on, and it's worth noting there are two particular ways in which algorithms use the information you've put into them to calculate your basal dose and help you. The first one is a user-guided algorithm. So this is what's used in Tandem T-Slim with their Control IQ and Basal IQ. So it's like driving an adaptive cruise control car. You're setting the speed, or in this case, you're putting in your basal profiles, and it's deciding whether to speed up or slow down based on what's going on. But at the core is the information of the basal that you have put in. Other pumps that are these learning pumps, they take a little bit more control on themselves, and they adapt over the previous 2 or 3 days. So we'll call them learning pumps. So they take a running average of how much your total daily insulin is over a period of 2 or 3 days, and they use that to figure out and estimate how much basal insulin it should be giving you. These types of pumps can be really good if you have a relatively regular schedule and you're doing the same thing day in and day out. The problem with these can be that they do have a 2 to 3 day lag period because they're going off old data. And what that means is that you don't have the ability sometimes to get ahead of a pattern if you know it's coming. So for particularly women, if you're going into your period and you're wanting to stay in the safeguard system or one of these algorithms, you don't have the ability to tell it, hey, I'm going to need more insulin today. It has to wait for 2 to 3 days to spin up its production while it gets used to and learns your new basal requirements, by which point you're maybe already out towards the end of the week and you're now no longer needing that level of insulin. So you're more likely to go high or low for those 2 to 3 day periods while the pump still adapts, and the same for sickness. The trade-off for those more user-guided algorithms is there's a little bit more mental energy. So you do have the ability to go in and update and program your basal settings, and the algorithm will respond to it. However, you need to remember to go in and turn it on and off. So depending on what you're after in your pump, it may impact which algorithm and which pump you like to use. So do you want to do less daily micromanagement and you're willing to ride out the 2 to 3 day lag time when changes in your life do happen? Then that adaptive system may be good for you, particularly if you have a relatively well regimented daily schedule that doesn't change week to week or month to month. Or do you want to have more proactive control and be ahead of predictable events like sickness and your hormone cycle? You may be able to achieve better blood sugar results, but there is that little bit of increased mental effort. So that's a lot of what we've talked about basal insulin. They're really the key topics you sort of need to be aware of in this space. We've covered what basal is, and we're aiming to, with our basal insulin, cover off the glucose trickle that's coming from our liver. We've looked at testing. How would you know if your basal's correct, and what are your triggers or indicators for increasing or decreasing? We've looked at some of those speed bumps there that can mean that out of your abnormal schedule or regimen that you may need to entertain the idea of changing your basal rates. And then we've had a bit of a conversation around the different types of pumps, as well as the manual modes and their automated modes, and the difference between those two automated modes of that sort of user-guided cruise control based on your settings that you input, and then this more fully automated but has a bit of a lag time as well. So there's some factors to consider there. Hope you've enjoyed that and you've really got a detailed understanding of basal insulin now. And I'll see you in the next Type 1 Foundation video, which will be all about bolus insulin and mealtime insulin. See you then.